Okay, so let's go ahead and get started then. I'm Randy Kearns, and tonight I want to go over so let's kind of recap the last several weeks. 2 weeks ago, a number of you, in fact, we were also impacted by the hurricane to the extent that I didn't have power for several days. I'm sure several of you were in the same situation. Didn't have internet. Actually went and stayed in a hotel for a couple of days. And then internet for us was pretty spotty for the last, I don't know, up until about the last 5 days. Hopefully you had a better experience. But anyway, during the course of that, I went ahead and extended all of the due dates for 2 weeks ago to end on this past Sunday night, which would have been the 8th. And then what I did for the next 2 weeks, then what would have been last week and this week, I went in and stripped out a couple of the course requirements so that you had less of an obligation. And really the only thing you have due this week, review the content for the 2 topics for both what would have been last week and this week, and take the quizzes for what would have been last week and this week. And I think there's also a certificate due for continuity of operations. If you completed the old program, it was the 546, 547 series. I think that's completely been abandoned now and replaced with IS 1300. And that's primarily because continuity of operations, they had, in my opinion, they had kind of broken apart too much of it. And so anyway, they did a good job consolidating it into one program. And so with that, let's talk a little bit about ethics and legal matters, certainly as it relates to disaster operations and disaster management. There is a bit of a challenge at times in terms of how we allocate resources, what the law requires, and then above and beyond, not just what the law requires, what's the fundamental right and wrong thing to do. And I would always encourage you to think about both of those things. Number one, from a legal standpoint, you always want to be sure that you're on the right side of the law. And I will tell you, sometimes we make decisions that we choose not to. Chances are in the last week, you've already made a choice that you weighed the value of what that law and what the impact was, and you decided to do something different. And if you're sitting there thinking, I didn't disobey a law in the last 2 weeks or the last week, tell me about your driving habits in New Orleans one more time. Every time you see a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit or a 35-mile-an-hour speed limit, or you're on the interstate and it's a 70-mile-an-hour speed limit. And the reality is we do make decisions at times that, you know, if the speed limit says 70 mile an hour, are you going to drive 70 or 65 or 75 or and again, that is that reality that I talk about. But just understand that there are consequences for that as well. You know, if knock on wood, I haven't spent any quality time in a trooper's vehicle, but I will tell you, sometimes they will stop you and want to spend some quality time talking with you about your driving habits and writing you a ticket so that they can remind you later on that you probably shouldn't have done that. But again, and that's a pretty benign example, but there is a reality of sometimes we don't know exactly all of the laws involved in situations. And so specifically as it relates to this course, I would just encourage you, depending on what your responsibilities are or will be, to understand what the rules are and to understand what the law allows. And then the legal matters are typically fairly bright lines of what's allowed and what's not allowed. Something that is a little bit more gray is the ethics. And the ethics are those, the ethics in my opinion is more that fundamental right and wrong. And so as we talk about ethics tonight, just bear in mind, you know, a part of that is shaped by your personal experiences, you know, things that you experience growing up, things that you've experienced in your personal life, things that you've experienced in your public life. And sometimes, you know, at different points in my life, I've managed some fairly large organizations. The largest organization I managed was, I had 520 employees. And, you know, and there were times that some of the things that shaped my behavior, the way I treated the employees, sometimes it was driven by some of the outstanding leadership I had worked for at some point in my life. And quite frankly, sometimes it was shaped by some of the absolutely deplorable people I've worked with at some point in my life. You know, sometimes you learn what to do as well as what not to do based on, you know, based on some of those personal experiences, and ethics help shape how you make those decisions. And so as we go through at least a handful of the slides tonight related to ethics and legal matters, just bear in mind that, again, the law and what the rules allow, those are typically bright lines. This is what the line is. And there are consequences for crossing that line. And the ethics are typically a little more subtle. They're not always things that are written down. There's a certain amount of intuition that goes with it. But again, we want to bring some of that out tonight. So we need to be sure that we can define the term ethics. We want to talk about its application and how ethics and the law intertwine and interconnect. In fact, I will tell you, sometimes the professors that typically teach standalone classes in ethics are usually lawyers or accountants, and that's because they have certain legal obligations to be sure that that what they're doing is related to, is certainly within the confines of ethical behavior. But having known some of the lawyers I have, and an accountant or two that that didn't always play by the rules, I did find it interesting that some of the legal profession would teach that. But anyway, nevertheless. Another piece about ethics also includes that moral community, and a challenge we have with what our moral obligation is, again, gets back to that self of, or that sense of what your obligation is, and how personal experiences have shaped behaviors that you have. Again, this kind of fundamental right and wrong piece really drives a lot of what we see as ethical behavior. There's certainly religious belief that has influence in how we see right and wrong. Certainly the law offers us bright lines of what's certainly legally acceptable, but there's also social norms and something called mores. You know, what are the what's the local and fundamental belief of how things should be done. Again, what's the connotation what type of evolutionary needs are there, what's your intuition, and then back to the constitutionality and legal doctrine. Um, uh, I've got several definitions that's included in your information tonight. Again, the point is to help you understand, how we see ethics and how we apply ethics to the disaster world and the disaster operation. And then as far as morality goes, again, there's certain moral norms that depending on your society or your social upbringing will vary ever so slightly. And a part of that is evolving too. What we may have considered certain morality by definition 40 years ago, we may not consider it the same way today. And a part of that is how our worldview has changed, how our community view has changed. And part of that is recognizing that the community is a lot bigger than, what your personal family experience was like 40 years ago compared to what it's like today. As far as teleology or utilitarian perspectives, again, part of this is to understand how we make some of the decisions or how we arrive at some of the decisions that we make. What else do we want to be sure and include here? I do have a couple of approaches listed to how we make moral decisions and what those approaches are. I would at least review that briefly before you take your quiz. Again, what are the 5 approaches to dealing with moral issues? And in terms of applying ethics during a catastrophic response, one of the things that we try to do, and particularly when I talk about the healthcare world, in the healthcare world, we try to be sure that we at least consider what the possibilities may be, particularly as we start to, the COVID pandemic is a great example right now. Long before the COVID pandemic struck, each hospital has an obligation to have an ethics committee, and a part of that is to be sure that they've pre-evaluated some of the catastrophic decision making that may need to take place. Now, fortunately, we didn't quite get there here in the New Orleans area, but there are a number of communities around the country right now that are on the brink of losing control of their capacity to manage the surge of patients with COVID-19. And when they do, how do you triage? How do you sort who you're going to use your life-saving equipment for, your life-saving skills, the space needed to care for the most acutely ill? How do you make those triage decisions? And again, part of that comes down to what type of resources do you have available. Again, just simply because we did a good job of getting on top of it here in the New Orleans area, we never quite got there, but New York did. New York for a time was overwhelmed with with the first wave of the COVID surge. Again, as a country, we'll probably see our 3rd wave. We're probably seeing our third wave now. It's not impacted us nearly as much in the New Orleans and for that matter, the greater Louisiana area as it has some states. But just understand that I talked with some people by conference call today who are contemplating how they set up multiple field hospitals in their state, simply because they're what they see is losing control of their ability to manage the surge of patients. And so, again, if To be quite honest, if they're just now thinking about it and they're at the brink of not being able to take care of the next patient that shows up at some of their hospitals, you know, I'm sure somebody at some level has thought about it and there's been some planning, but the conversation we had today told me that there probably hadn't been as much conversation as maybe they needed to have. Hopefully they'll be able to make some changes in the coming hours, days, weeks, that allows them to save lives. But again, that ethical framework really needs to have, and hopefully they have considered that long before the application of it. In terms of triage, to be quite honest, we've made triage decisions for years in the healthcare world. And what I'm talking about with triage, again, depending on what type of resources you have available, will depend on who gets the most care. And I'll give you an example. I used to work as a paramedic, and I used to operate on a smaller vehicle by myself. We were called first response medics, and so there were certain scenes that I would arrive at the scene before anybody else did. And in one particular case, I arrived and I had a patient with, he was 18 years of age, but he had some fairly obvious mortal injuries, although by clinical standards he was technically still alive. The potential for life-saving in his case was not good. He was pinned in the vehicle. He had agonal respirations, meaning he was obviously dying. And then I had two other patients who were critical and needed immediate care, needed immediate life-saving intervention. And I chose to take care of them before I took care of the 18-year-old because there was one of me, one set of equipment, and I had three critical patients. Now, as fate would have it, we wound up with another crew that was able to clear another call. They showed up on the scene within just a couple of minutes, and we re-triaged that 18-year-old from what we call a black tag, which is dead or fatal injuries, to a red tag. Now, he still expired, he still died from his injuries, but the difference was when we had additional crews that could show up and we could now reallocate resources so that everybody had the potential to be saved, to receive the most critical life-saving resources we had, then we could allocate them to everyone. But when you can't, you have to make a decision of who are the most viable patients, who are the ones that are most likely to live from their injuries. And you know, it obviously, for me to still remember that case today, and it happened in, I think, 1985 or 1986, it tells you it you know, it left an impression with me. But you know, those are decisions that people make on somewhat of a regular basis, depending on how resources are allocated and how they're available. You certainly have to use legal guidelines in making those decisions and ethical guidelines, but quite honestly, we have a triage system that we use, and that's what we stick with. And then again, we reevaluate as we have more resources available. And so when we think about principles of planning and policy formation, there are a lot of things that we look at. I do get down to number 6, evidence-based. One of the things we try to do as much as anything is to be sure that we use science to drive and inform the decision-making process we have. Let's see, I do need to skip through several of these to be sure that I've got time to cover. I want to be sure and cover at least the topics in recovery. And I've got about 10 more minutes worth of things I want to be sure and cover. And ethics and legal. Again, number of code of ethics that are out there. It is important to understand the extent of what professional duty is. And the reason professional duty is important is there's something in each state called the Good Samaritan Doctrine. If you have a religious background and you're familiar with the Good Samaritan parable, that's generally the basis for creating the law. But just understand that most states have some type of a law that basically protects you as an individual from legal exposure, as long as you don't purposefully do something to harm a patient, and as long as you're functioning within the scope of what your knowledge base is. What would a reasonable person do under reasonable circumstances? Now, there's two different ways that we can apply this. Let me give you an example. Let's say I am a volunteer firefighter, and I have a pager or a beeper or some type of means of notifying me that there's a vehicle accident, and I respond to that vehicle accident. I'm no longer protected under the Good Samaritan Doctrine because I'm now officially a responder in a responder capacity. I've got certain laws that do protect me, but they're more, now they're based on what my professional obligation is, based on my training and experience and the equipment I have available. And so there are protections, but those protections don't extend through what's called the Good Samaritan Doctrine. The Good Samaritan Doctrine is, I can still be that volunteer firefighter with medical training, but now I'm driving down the highway. I have no prior knowledge. I top the hill around the curve, and I come across a vehicle accident, and there's someone there that's injured. If I stop and render aid, I'm now protected under the Good Samaritan Doctrine. Again, and the key piece is prior knowledge. I had no prior knowledge of the event. I just happened upon it, and I felt that I had a duty to stop and provide care, and so I did. It's called a duty to act. So I had a duty to act. I provided that care. I provided the care within my scope of practice. At that point, there is Good Samaritan protection, but it's only because I had no prior knowledge. If you have prior knowledge, then Good Samaritan doesn't protect you, but there are other laws that do. But that's typically the dividing point. If you don't know about it and you stumble across an accident or injury and you provide care, I think I've got, yeah, so this is the origin of the Good Samaritan. It's found in the New Testament. Luke, if you didn't know, Luke, by the way, was a physician. The Good Samaritan Doctrine, key pieces: no prior knowledge, duty to act, imminent peril, you're not being compensated, you do have an obligation to remain, and you have an obligation to seek consent, meaning if the patient tells you, go away, don't help me, you don't have consent to provide care, so you do at that point can disengage from the patient. And this is the Good Samaritan law in Louisiana. If you don't have a license to practice, and again, you have no prior knowledge, in good faith you're rendering aid or first aid, that's the protection of the Good Samaritan law. So let's kind of move through just a couple of things I do want to get into. So the US Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And I do want to be sure and separate federal powers and state powers. Just understand that today we think of the United States more as one distinct country. The reality is the United States still remains 50 independent states, and there's also 6 territories or commonwealths that are not states. Guam, Northern Marianas, American Samoa, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the District of Columbia. And also previously, at some point, the Philippines was a part of the United States, and so was Cuba. But over time, the 50 states became a part of the United States. Over time, they each were admitted at one point or another. But there's a difference between what the federal laws and what federal powers are and what state laws and state powers are. Let me give you an example. If I'm driving down Interstate 10 and a state trooper gets behind me and clocks me at 80 mile an hour in a 70 mile an hour speed limit, that's a state law enforced by a state trooper. And if I wind up going to court, I'm going to go to state court. And no federal law has been violated, although you could argue that it's an interstate highway, but just generally speaking, interstates are the jurisdiction is primarily to the state government to enforce. If I shoot someone or I assault someone, again, typically the law that I have violated is a state law, and so that's tried in a state court, and my ultimate appeal would be to the state Supreme Court or a state appellate court and then the state Supreme Court. Just understand that if I violate a state law, I'm not going to be tried in a federal court. And obviously that's not going to wind up in a federal appellate court or the U.S. Supreme Court. Conversely speaking, if I do something, if I'm down at the federal courthouse and or I'm in the post office is a federal building, and I do something to disrupt the flow of mail, I set off a bomb in the post office. Now I've done damage to a federal building, I've interrupted a federal operation, I've violated a federal law. Now I can be tried in a federal court. And again, my appeals at that point are outside of the state system. My appeals at that point are within the federal system because that's my venue of jurisdiction. And then the other piece I want to be sure that we understand include the three branches of government. The legislative branch, again, on a national level, is the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. Okay, 435 members of the House, 100 members of the U.S. Senate, 2 senators per state, and then the House members are based on population distribution. The largest state is California. I think they have 55 congressmen. The smallest states include like Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota. Those states each have 1 congressman. They have 2 senators, but 1 congressman. So the legislative process typically starts in the House, and then if it's a bill that's passed in the House, it moves over to the Senate. And the Senate can either take up the legislation and approve it just as it is, or they can sometimes introduce a similar bill. And then what they do is they create a conference committee and they reconcile the differences between the 2 bills so that the House can pass the same legislation that the Senate can pass. And then at the point that that bill is passed, it goes to the president's desk for his signature. And provided he signs off on it, then it becomes law. Well, once it becomes law, then at that point, the executive branch oversees how policies are implemented reflecting that law. So as an example, after the Affordable Care Act was passed, so it was passed by the House, conferred with the Senate approved it, it was signed into law by President Obama. But who implements that law? Who implements policies? Who writes policies to make that law work? That's Health and Human Services, and Health and Human Services at the federal level is overseen by the executive branch, and the executive branch oversees those things. And so the executive branch has the obligation to carry that out and to see that it's enforced. Well, what happens if later on someone has legal standing and they believe they've been harmed by that law, the Affordable Care Act? They have a right to dispute it. And depending on who has legal authority, provided you have standing, and without getting into those details at the moment, just understand that you can appeal that. You'll wind up in a federal district court. You could wind up in an appellate court, and ultimately you could wind up at the U.S. Supreme Court. Just understand the court system is the judiciary system. Our government was structured, our federal government was structured with three branches: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. The viewpoint by the founders was to be sure that no single branch was more powerful than the other. The judicial branch has its own set of rules, and there are certain things that they're certainly responsible for. There's 9 Supreme Court justices, but there's literally hundreds of federal judges in different parts of the United States, depending on whether you're in a district court or an appellate court. And then again, from the legislative standpoint, that's the House and the Senate. And then from the executive standpoint, that's overseen by the president and people that he or one day she appoints to oversee the operation of the federal government. So just understand that's the federal side of it. On a state side, we have a state governor, we have a state house, a state senate, and we have a state court system. And all of that is based on state laws and state obligations. But there's a bright line between what state laws govern typically and what federal laws govern. Very seldom do you wind up finding someone who is tried for something in state court and then they wind up being tried for, you can't be tried for the same thing, but you can be, it could be you violated a federal law at the same time you violated a state law. It's a different law, but just understand this is a rare situation. Typically speaking, you're going to wind up with a charge in one court, either at a state level or at a federal level, and it's going to play out at that point. Anyway, I just want to be sure you understand the difference between state laws and federal laws, and understand the difference between the power of the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Every 4 years we have a presidential election, and some are happy and some are disappointed in the outcome. But the reality is, January 20th, we'll have an inauguration. We did 2017, we did 2013, we did 2009, and life goes on. I mean, that's the way we do things here in the United States, and it's constitutionally bound that will happen. I'm sure there'll be some fighting between now and then, but December 14th, the Electoral College votes, and we have a what's called a democratic republic that allows that to occur. And anyway, I've got some graphics here. I don't know that it's terribly important, but it is important to understand the difference between the roles of state government versus federal government. And then what are the roles of the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch? You may have heard a lot of stare decisis. What stare decisis really means: once a law's been settled, typically it stays that way. Occasionally you'll hear the Supreme Court revisit a point, but they're looking at pieces around the perimeter and not the actual point itself. And then I've compared a couple of things between state law, criminal law versus civil law, constitutional rights. What are key constitutional rights? Again, we don't have a lot of time for that tonight, but I did include that in the lecture if you want to spend a little bit of time going over it. Civil rights laws really reshaped this country, although although the war between the states really established in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, certainly established a lot of what needed to change in the country. The reality was it was not until Title VI of the Civil Rights Act that changed a lot of things the way they needed to be changed. And we continue to deal with, the advantage to America is there's a lot of us from a lot of different places. The disadvantage is sometimes we use that as a reason to divide ourselves instead of appreciate the differences we have. Anyway, I've included some executive orders, international health regulations, human rights laws, and how that kind of fits into disaster operations. And is there anything else we want to be sure and cover? Not really. So with that, let me go ahead and transition quickly to disaster recovery. For my background today, I decided to choose an emergency operations center. I hope you don't mind. Let me stop sharing that screen and let me move to, let's see. Well, where's it at? Hang on just a minute. Let me find the other presentation. Got too many screens. Okay, let me close that one out. Let me go to, that's the one I want. Okay, so let's put it over here. Let's bring it to that. And then let's share that screen. Okay, again, if you'll just either in the chat or someone open your mic.
Dr. Kearns, I think that you are mute.
I think you're right. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, and is the presentation you can see, is it the one dealing with disaster recovery?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so as we kind of make our transition to disaster recovery, again, your four primary phases of disaster, the planning preparedness phase, the response phase, the recovery phase, and the mitigation phase. Recovery typically starts the moment the last rescue has been completed, ending what we consider the response phase of the disaster. And the whole point to recovery is we typically have two stages of recovery, short-term and long-term. If you think about Lake Charles as an example, or if you think about New Orleans 2 weeks ago, the immediate short-term need, once rescues had occurred, once anyone having any type of medical condition or any type of injury that may have been associated with the disaster, once those things ended, one of the first things that needed to be done was restoration of essential services. That includes unblocking highways so that responders can get through. It includes what's called emergency debris removal. It also includes sometimes temporary restoration of power and essential services. I can tell you, so the hurricane struck here at approximately 1700 or 5 o'clock last Wednesday. And as the hurricane struck, almost immediately, lots of people lost power. And And so the next morning, I would say there were at least um, at least 10 or more hospitals or nursing homes that were relying on emergency power, meaning generator power, to operate. And you know, key essential services you've got to have to be able to operate a hospital. You've got to have electricity. You've got to have some connection to the internet. You've got to have water, and you've got to have sewer. And your facility has to be intact. And so, you know, if you what a lot of facilities will do, um, most of them are obligated or required to have backup generators. You know, some of the generators at least University Medical Center and Oshner, Maine on Jefferson Highway, they're what's called generator farm, which is a large area with substantial number of generators, will actually power a small city. And then you also have to have, you know, an ongoing fuel supply so that you can power those generators. In most cases, it's either natural gas or that may be augmented by propane, but the whole point is you've got to have power. And so it may be a temporary bridge to restoring, you know, getting you back on the grid, but that's what recovery is. Recovery is helping you get back to where you were. And we typically break that up into two sections: short-term recovery and long-term recovery. The short-term recovery is just being sure that we've got the lights back on, maybe reconnecting you to the internet, but being sure that that for the most part, you've got the things working that you need to have working. Long-term recovery depends on how much damage has occurred. You know, I've been involved in a number of disaster responses where maybe someone lost a bridge or someone lost a dam, or there was substantial structural damage. And so when that occurs, long-term recovery may include building a replacement bridge, building a replacement hospital, building a replacement building. So you've got to have a short-term solution. How do you deal with it on the short term? And then you've got to have a long-term solution. How do you, you know, in a long-term way, if you think about Interstate 10 after Hurricane Katrina, you know, there's only a small piece of what was Interstate 10 that's even visible today from, you know, from what was washed away or pushed into the water by the storm surge during Hurricane Katrina. And so, you know, their short-term recovery was to get one side of the interstate open. The long-term recovery was what we have today, and that's, you know, 3 lanes going east and 3 lanes going west of a very large, elevated, very well-built highway. And so it is, again, just be sure that you understand response ends when we've made our last rescue, and recovery begins at that moment. And the short-term recovery is to get things back working. And the long-term recovery may include some mitigation efforts. How do we build it back stronger so that we don't have to deal with that in the future? And hopefully some of the things that we've seen in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina was to be sure that whatever we built back in a way to help us avoid some of the things that we saw with Hurricane Katrina. Again, any part of a disaster is, again, defining what the elements are. And I will tell you, sometimes you'll see some literature discussing the difference between a disaster and a catastrophe. I throw this in here only for the sake of helping you understand. Yeah, we kind of differentiate the difference between a disaster and a catastrophe, but quite honestly, the terms are typically seen as synonymous. If there is a difference, it's a subtle difference, and the subtle difference is a catastrophe is basically a disaster that also includes substantial infrastructure damage. We would have definitely called the damage to the New Orleans area after Hurricane Katrina a catastrophe. We had 47 levee breaches at different parts of the city. There was no single breach that led to, there were substantial breaches in multiple places. Interstate 10, much of it washed over into that connection between, what is it, Lake Bourgeron and Lake Pontchartrain. If you think about all of the ways out of New Orleans, most of them didn't exist or had poor access because of storm surge and damage awaiting an engineering report before they could reopen some of those areas. Definitely a catastrophe by this definition. And again, in terms of recovery, we tend to focus on the physical things because we can build stuff back. There's also a social and psychological thing that's there and certainly has to be accounted for. We can't just tell somebody you just got to suck it up and get over it. It's more complicated than that. You see a lot of depression after a disaster and during a disaster, and rightfully so. I mean, there are some people who lose literally everything they've owned, and while it's easy to say, your life was spared, so you can always put everything back together. There's a reality of sometimes losing family items or lifelong things that have been with you that seem irreplaceable, and people struggle. People have difficulty coping with some of these things at times, and it's important for us to do our best to put ourselves in their position, to be empathetic, and to do our best to help them get through a disaster, not just from the physical recovery, but understand the mental impact that occurred to them in a way that many of us sometimes can't truly appreciate if we weren't there. Again, positive outcomes, the hazard mitigation is the key piece. How do we not just affect recovery, but affect recovery in a way that we build it back stronger and better than it was before? Again, I get back to my conversation with a civil engineer for the Army Corps of Engineers. I asked him, are we safe in New Orleans? And he said, we're safer. He said, we're safer than the people who live in Houston or Tampa or Miami or Jacksonville. And he started naming some of the other port cities that certainly also had some substantial risk. But he said, safe is a relative term. He said, New Orleans is technically an island, we're surrounded by water. And so there's always going to be this struggle. There's always going to be a challenge of protecting the city and consequently all of the people and the infrastructure within the city. But there is a post-event window of opportunity that's certainly there to, again, build it back better, to build it back stronger, and to try and discourage people from building back in those areas that are at the greatest risk. Early on, there is decreased levels of social conflict. We saw that after 9/11. Probably the one most unifying thing to the country, at least as an American, in September 13th, 14th, 15th of the year 2001, was that unifying event with decreased levels of social conflict. It's almost as if it is human nature to want to have a villain. Sometimes we find those villains within our own country, and sometimes it's easy to see them somewhere else. But anytime there's a villain out there, it's a lot easier for, one side to coalesce around how do we deal with that, that awful person who attacked us or whatever. Anyway, and then the negative outcomes. Certainly, one challenge New Orleans has had in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, we're still at less than 75% of the population of the city at the time the hurricane struck. And, and there is an ongoing question outside of the city and in other circles of, should New Orleans ever be what it once was? Just understand, in 1960, New Orleans was larger than Houston. In 1960, New Orleans was the largest city in the South, the American South. And so a lot has changed in the last 60 years. Part of it's brought on by the fact that, there's a limited amount of area that the city can expand to. Part of it was challenged by Hurricane Betsy and Hurricane Katrina and some other social strife that went on here in the 1980s. And so, there is that reality. But disasters do create the big reset of how do you get a chance to start over, and what do you start over with, and what do you envision down the road? If you ever wind up in an opportunity to look down the road and look for a recovery strategy, the best time to do it is well before the disaster takes place. Let me kind of move through there's only a couple of slides that I want to be sure and show tonight before I wrap up. Again, just to understand these elements of recovery. The physical stuff is easy for us to measure. It's easy for us to see. The social recovery is a little bit more difficult because it's tough for us to measure and understand what other people are going through. The economic recovery, even today, particularly with the pandemic, there are people right now who are hurting in a really dramatic way. Not everyone can work from home. Not everyone wants to work from home. If the truth was told, I would much prefer to be in the classroom with you, but it's just not available to us right now. But it does get back to that economic recovery. I am thankful in the fact that I have a job. There are a lot of people that right now don't have a job, or either grossly underpaid compared to what they were making before the disaster, and the pandemic is another disaster. And so how do you help stimulate the economy and spur the city back to growth? A part of that will come with how we learn to deal with the disease, and hopefully with a vaccine that comes sooner rather than later. But anyway, and then the last piece is the environmental recovery. As we saw after Hurricane Katrina, there were substantial parts of the city that had some significant amounts of environmental damage. And so, nature does settle in, and there's certain amounts of regrowth that takes place, but there's certain amounts that in some cases, climate change, as an example, is causing substantial loss of wetlands that have for 100 years been out in front of New Orleans and helped absorb storm surge from previous disasters. As we continue to lose, hundreds of acres really each year, at some point there's a tipping point to when that really becomes catastrophic compared to where we are right now. Let's skip some of this stuff. Again, I've talked about short-term and long-term recovery and the phase of when recovery starts. I do have this is a slightly new piece of research dealing with restoration, reconstruction, and reconstruction in terms of major reconstruction. Again, the disaster recovery process. Understand the emergency support functions, just simply because if you ever wind up in an emergency operations center, what would you wind up doing? Who would you reach out to? And typically these desks are either personally manned or virtually available to you when you stand up in emergency operations center. What else do we want to be sure and say? I have included some basic overview information of both the federal operation, the state operation, and then local government. Again, Louisiana is a little bit different in the fact that we call our local governments parishes. The other 49 states refer to them as counties. So a lot of the literature that you'll read will talk about the county government instead of the parish government, but just understand it's one and the same. Okay, I don't think I have anything else here that I wanted to be sure and cover tonight. Yeah, let's kind of wrap up with this. So again, let me look quickly at the middle shell. So week 12 and week 13, again, ethics and legal matter, and then continuity and recovery. And I did hide a quiz that you won't need to take. And I stripped out the discussion threads for this week and last week. So if you'll focus on getting your IS 2900A done, your legal and ethics quiz done, and then I think there's an IS, there is IS 1300 done. If you previously completed IS 546 and 547, I think those have been retired, but if you completed those, you can submit those in lieu of IS 1300, but I think IS 1300 is all you can take now. And so again, those 2 certificates and the 2 quizzes, and you should wrap it up for this week. And then I'll make what's available for next week active in the next several days. Are there any questions?
Nope. No questions.
Yes. Are there any questions?
No questions.
Okay.
No,
Was that helpful?
very helpful.
Okay. Okay. Again, the big piece that I will tell you is to I try to be sure that I help you understand the terms associated with what's out there and how they impact the things that we do in disaster preparedness. You know, the last couple of weeks of class, we're primarily going to look at just another couple of disasters in terms of things that we would do for preparedness, but to also talk about the stress associated with disaster operations and how people either have dealt with it or have not dealt with it. It is an important aspect, both from the person providing care and the person involved in the response, as well as those who are at the center of the disaster. Again, I can't possibly understand what everyone has experienced during a Hurricane Katrina, because I wasn't in the middle of Hurricane Katrina. And even if I had been here, I would have had one experience. And my one experience would have been, in some cases, dramatically different than somebody else's experience. You know, my hurricane experience was as a responder, setting up and operating a field hospital in Mississippi. The only time I dealt with people from New Orleans was evacuees in the hotel population in Atlanta. And each of them had a different story, and particularly had a different story than some of the people I dealt with who were evacuees from Mississippi. The big picture I would tell you in wrapping up is this. it's always important to have empathy for what other people are feeling and what other people are dealing with. And a disaster is certainly one of those times that we certainly need to be at our best to help people who are in some cases at their worst. I hope that was helpful, and I don't have anything else for tonight. Let me go ahead and wrap it up. Again, last chance, any questions? And if not, always feel free to email me or contact me. I'll be glad to get back to you. If I don't, contact me again. But I typically try to respond within 24 hours. Okay, you all have a good night.
Thank you, you too.
I'll see you next week on Zoom.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye.